Hello friends, this video on Cell, the Unit of Life, Part 11 is brought to you by examfear.com. No more fear from exam. Now we will talk about the next important part of the cell, that is the cell wall. Now as far as the boundary of the cell to ensure protection is concerned, cell membrane was the most important part. Now we are going to talk about the next boundary, which is cell wall, which is however not present in all types of cell. So cell wall is something which is present only in case of plant cells. So here we will see why it is present only in plant cells, what is the function that it performs, and how is it composed of. So this is present only in plant and this is present only in plant cells and in some fungi. So it is absolutely absent in animal cells. So they do not need an additional cell wall. Now the question is, where is it present? The cell wall is present outside the plasma membrane. So it is a rigid covering outside plasma membrane. So just to note here, when we were talking about plasma membrane, it was a thin, delicate, flexible covering, but here the cell wall, it is a rigid covering, tough and hard enough. So this is how it looks like. So here if you see the yellow colored boundary which you see, that is the plasma membrane, and outside that you see the green colored structure which is nothing but the cell wall. It is non-living, rigid and fully permeable. So this is again another difference, that the plasma membrane was a living membrane, but this is non-living, rigid and fully permeable. While we were talking about plasma membrane, I told that plasma membrane is selectively permeable. That is, it allows certain particles to move through it. It doesn't allow certain particles. So it is quite selective in allowing particles to pass through it. But as far as cell wall is concerned, it is fully permeable. That means it allows everything to pass through it. So, by looking at this property, what can you see about cell wall? Will cell wall ensure a lot of protection as far as movement of particles is concerned? No, because it will allow all the particles. But then what is the point of having a cell wall? Looking at the property again, you can see that the cell wall is very rigid. So it can provide a lot of structural and mechanical support because it is hard, tough and rigid. And that is also a reason why it is present only in plant cells and not in animal cells. Because in plant cells, if you see, they are like very delicate. So they need a lot of structural support. And that structural support is provided by their cells. Whereas in case of animals, we have the structure made in such a way that we have the skeletal system, we have the muscles, bones, etc. to support the body. So it is not required that every cell has an additional cell wall. Talking about the composition, it is composed mainly of cellulose, which makes it hard and tough. So this is how a cellulose look like. So what is cellulose? It is basically an organic compound again with a quite complex structure, as you can see here. It is nothing but a linear chain of several linked glucose units. I mean, when too many glucose units get connected to each other, they give rise to cellulose. And another important thing is, this is one of the most abundant polymer on earth. So quite abundant, and that is why you see a lot of plants are there. So they'll have cell walls, and their cell walls are made up of cellulose. So now you can relate it to that. While talking about the digestive system, I told you, right, that it is easier to digest flesh than to digest plants. That is because plants are composed of cellulose. That is because in plant, each and every cell wall is made up of cellulose. Now let us look at the structure of the cell wall, that is the layers in the cell wall. So now again, when we talk about the cell wall, there are different layers even within the cell wall. So let us first talk about primary cell wall. It is nothing but cell wall of a young plant cell. So when a plant cell is very young, that time you just see one layer of cell wall, and that single layer is called primary cell wall. So this wall is capable of growth, because as the plant is growing, each and every part of it should also grow. So this cell wall also keeps growing with the plant. It is composed of loose network of cellulose microfibrils. So microfibrils are nothing but thread-like structures. It gradually diminishes as the cell matures. Now what happens is, when the plant has just started growing, when it is a small plant, young plant, so that time it just have one layer of cell wall, and that is the primary cell wall. Now as the plant continues to grow, that cell wall also grows, and that cell wall gradually gives rise to secondary cell wall, and primary cell wall gradually diminishes. So by the time the plant is completely matured, they have a completely formed secondary cell wall, and the primary cell wall vanishes. So let us look at the secondary cell wall. It is formed as the cell matures. As I said, it is located between the cell membrane and the primary cell wall. So if you look at the cross section of a cell, or if you look at a cell, let us suppose this is your cell. So just the immediate boundary of the cell is nothing but the cell membrane. So this is your cell membrane. Inside you have the entire cell, you have nucleus, you have everything. So this is your cell. This is your cell membrane. Now outside the cell membrane, you have cell wall. Now when the plant is young, this is nothing but your primary cell wall. This is when the plant is young. Now as the plant is growing, this primary cell wall will give rise to secondary cell wall. So where is that secondary cell wall? That will be formed inside the primary cell wall. So this is your secondary cell wall. So what happens is, the thickness of the primary cell wall will gradually keep on reducing as the plant matures. So this secondary cell wall is between cell membrane and primary cell wall. Talking about the thickness, it is thicker and harder than the primary cell wall, composed of cellulose and lignin. Lignin is the component which makes it even harder, because wherever you have lignin, it makes it really hard. So this is how you have your the layers of your cell wall. Now talking about the cells where you can actually see a primary cell wall or secondary cell wall, let us look at some of the examples. You remember we spoke about the plant tissues in one of our previous lessons, where we talked about parenchyma, collenchyma, sclerenchyma. So now looking at these definitions of primary cell wall and secondary cell wall, can you tell what kind of cell walls do you see in case of parenchyma cells? Parenchyma cells are those which do not have any thickened corners, nothing. So they have primary cell walls. So the parenchyma cells have primary cell walls. Now, it is not necessary that all cells will have to secrete a secondary wall. And the example is a parenchyma cell. In case of parenchyma cell, even when the cell becomes mature, they do not secrete a secondary cell wall. So they live with a primary cell wall throughout their life. Whereas if you look at the structures of collenchyma, sclerenchyma, or fibers or tracheids, when you look at the structures of all these plant cells, these were tissues, and the tissues were made up of cells. So looking at all these things, what do you see when you look at their structure? We have already studied their structures, right? And we saw that they have thickened corners. Some of them have lignin thickenings at their corners. So these thickened corners were nothing but due to the formation of secondary cell wall. So secondary cell wall is formed on maturity in all of these tissues: collenchyma, sclerenchyma, fibers, tracheids. Right, so these are the layers of cell wall. Now, there is another additional layer which is again a part of cell wall, which is present even outside the primary cell wall, and that is known as middle lamella. Why is the name middle lamella? We'll see that. It is basically a layer between two cells. So now, as I was explaining in the previous slide, if this is your cell, so this is your cell membrane. Outside the cell membrane, you have secondary cell wall. outside the secondary cell wall, you have the primary cell wall. And now outside the primary cell wall, you have middle lamella. So this layer is middle lamella. So what will middle lamella do? It separates, or it is a layer between two cells, because just beside this cell, there will be another cell. So even that another cell will also have a plasma membrane, a secondary cell wall, a primary cell wall. So this cell will also have all these things. So basically this middle lamella will separate these two cells. So here I did not draw it properly, so there is a gap, but otherwise this layer is going to separate, or it is a layer between the two cells. It is composed of calcium pectate. This is the composition. It binds adjacent cells together. So why do we have this? So that this, because up to cell wall, it is all part of one cell. Similarly, up to this cell wall, it is part of this cell. So if we have a layer in between like this, that can actually join these two cells. So it can bind the adjacent. Thank you. Please visit www.examfear.com to watch more videos, attempt free online test, get free study material, find tutors and mentors. Thank you once again.